Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 9th installment of the series Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History. Last session we were talking about the Greek discovery of the mind, and today we're going to switch back to the Near East to talk about mythology and religion. I'm no expert on the subject of Near Eastern mythology, so I'm going to be making reference to a work by Barry Powell. This will become increasingly important as we talk about the Babylonian captivity. You know, what's so bad about being captured by Babylon? And what kind of impact does this have on the Jewish people? So in order to do this, we are going to need to go way back, because the Babylonians that we're talking about today are sometimes called Chaldeans. At other times they're called the Neo-Babylonians. There were Babylonians who were very powerful during the Bronze Age, and we shouldn't confuse them with the Neo-Babylonians, although there is a fair deal of overlap culturally between these two people. They're just separated by a good 1,000 years of time. And what we're going to see is that it's mythology, religion. This is one of the binding factors between the Old Babylonians of the Bronze Age and the Neo-Babylonians of the Iron Age, who would capture Israel. Okay, so whereas such myths as those of the Trojan War appear Greek in origin, these go back to the Bronze Age, there are lots of other important myths that had their beginnings outside of Greece. We have creation myths that find their way into Greece, which come from a non-Indo-European Near East. Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is modern-day Iraq, was a particularly important source of these myths. So, for example, the Greek myth of origin concerning the succession of gods, this certainly was of Mesopotamian origin, the story that we described in Hesiod. These stories might have come to Greece during the Bronze Age, but they were probably more likely imported by Eastern traders during the late Dark Age, as they call it, at the same time that the Greeks were discovering the use of the alphabet by reappropriating Phoenician writing. This happened around 800 BC. So, until about 300 years ago, Europeans knew pretty much nothing about the ancient Near East. Most of what people knew came from the Old Testament, which had been preserved in its original Hebrew and Aramaic, then translated into Greek around 300 BC, and then Latin at a much later date. There are all sorts of references to the Near East in Greek and Latin authors, but these are generally inaccurate. So in the 17th century, European travelers started to enter the ancient Near East, both physically and in their minds, and they started to bring back first-hand reports. So, for example, a man like Pietro della Valle, an Italian nobleman, journeyed to Constantinople, to Egypt, Palestine, Persepolis. There he copied from a palace door, he made a squeeze, of several inscriptions that were written in 3 different forms of an unknown script. In 1700, there was an Oxford scholar who, although he was unable to read these inscriptions, he gave them the name cuneiform, wedge-shaped writing. So from about this time onward, there was a stream of archaeological material coming in from the Near East to find its way in Western European museums. There were a lot of clay tablets, and all of these had all sorts of ancient languages from the region, which over time were distinguished from one another and deciphered. In 1872, a British scholar named George Smith reported that he deciphered a tablet describing a universal flood, a flood that had destroyed all of humankind. The next year, in Mesopotamia, Smith found a text of the Babylonian story of creation, which we call the Enuma Elish, and it seemed to them that the much later composer of Genesis, the biblical book of creation, had borrowed from this work. This rocked the Christian world, because how can you regard Genesis as an original work of divine revelation if all of its parallels are found in the texts of pagans? So, not surprisingly, these and other discoveries forced people to reconsider the importance of myth. So, to talk about Babylonian myth, like I said, we're going to go way back. We've got to go back to Sumerian myth. It wasn't until World War II that we got reliable information about the Sumerians, and few of their myths come down to us complete. A lot of what we know about the Sumerians has to be inferred from cryptic texts that are imprinted into pretty badly broken clay tablets. We depend heavily on reconstructions by really a small handful of scholars whose translations are not so much literal renderings, but educated guesses as to what the meaning really was. The Sumerians were of, let's say, unknown racial stock. They spoke a linguistic isolate, so their language was unrelated to any language that we know today. They lived very close to the Persian Gulf, in treeless and stoneless mudlands, and their culture appeared somewhat suddenly, around 4000 BC. According to their own traditions, they came from outside of Mesopotamia, either from perhaps Iran or India. So, supported by irrigation and agriculture, which they actually invented, the Sumerians created the first full-fledged city-states by about 3000 BC, which was approximately the start date for our history together. Their cities had as many as 40 or 50,000 inhabitants each. These types of concentrations of human beings hadn't ever been experienced on this planet before, at least not that we can find in the record. Cities of this magnitude had their own protective deities. So, when one city conquered another city, this was represented as a victory of one local deity over another. There were cosmic dimensions to conquest. These deities lived inside of temples. Temples were homes for the god. These were at the center of the city, and often on top of tall terraced pyramids that we today call ziggurats. Times of prosperity brought slaves and gold and animals and cloths and spices to these cities, but some over time sank into, let's say, decadence and were destroyed. Irrigation greatly increased the food supply, but it demanded a social cooperation under the rule of a king, an absolute monarch. The king's most powerful tool was cuneiform writing. Writing would appear in Egypt just slightly later, and it was apparently influenced by the Mesopotamian example. So, as in all polytheistic religions, there were dozens, even hundreds of gods in the Sumerian pantheon. An, A-N, which means sky, was the god of the infinite expanse, of the vault above us. The vault in which the sun travels and from which the rain falls. He was the personification of the Near Eastern king. And this vision of a supreme god as a king would have profound impacts on the rest of history and even have an impact on our consciousness and our conception of God. The kings called their rulership Anitu, Anuship, let's say. This was the institution of kingship that made Mesopotamian civilization possible. This came down from the sky. It's like the Chinese mandate of heaven, or the divine right of kings. So this god, An, began as an important figure in the myths of creation, but then essentially shrank in importance with regard to human affairs, in the same way that Uranus in Greek myth shrank into the background, making way for Zeus, his grandson. So in a grand stroke of synchronicity, as we're talking about Zeus, the sky has just opened up and a thunderstorm has rolled in. So if you hear the rumbling in the background, that's what that is. Okay, so we've got An, the sky god, the first sky god. His daughter is Inanna. Notice the An in the middle of Inanna. She's the queen of heaven. She was the goddess of love, sexual love, and, strangely enough, the goddess of war as well. We could maybe say that she is the goddess of attraction and repulsion. She had an insatiable lust for suitors. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's said that 120 lovers couldn't satisfy her, and this is why Gilgamesh refuses her advances. He's afraid of being destroyed by the goddess. This would be a motif that would reoccur in all sorts of different traditions for a long time to come. That is, the goddess who destroys her lovers. So, as an embodied divine authority, Enlil, the Lord of the Storm, embodied force, violence, and the thunderstorm. He was also a king. He was An's agent on Earth, and he was personally involved with earthly events. He was both beneficial and maleficent or destructive. He brought both rain, which fertilized the soil, and he also dried up the flood waters. He brought locusts. He brought in hordes of hillmen eager to prey on lowland cities, ready for the plucking Enlil's position, you could say, is similar to that of Zeus in Greek myth. Next, we have Enki, the lord of the earth. He was named Enki because he ruled the sweet groundwater found beneath the soil, the water that could be drawn up with wells, that could be drunk. This is the water of civilization, as opposed to the saline waters of the sea, which are deadly and useless in agriculture. He was an active fertilizing principle. In the same way that water takes devious paths between and around obstacles, Enki was the clever, crafty god, the trickster of Sumerian mythology. He was also the god of wisdom and magic, who instructed humanity in the arts. He's a sort of Promethean figure. He's mercurial and Promethean. He's also got a bit of Hephaestus and Poseidon and Dionysus in him as well. These are not perfect cognates, but rough estimations. So the mother goddess of the Sumerians had plenty of names. She was just named Ki, Earth. She was Mother Earth. She was the rich silt buildup on the side of riverbanks. She united with Enki to produce the first vegetation. We could maybe say she is analogous to Demeter in the Greek tradition. Next up, we've got Ereshkigal. She's the queen of the great below, the Sumerian goddess of death. We see the Ki from Earth, Ki in Ereshkigal. She's an aspect of Ki. She's the dark soil in which the bodies of the dead were laid. So in this regard, she is similar to Persephone in Greek myth. Mesopotamian myths are fairly vague when it comes to the physical descriptions of the gods. We've got representations of them, but we've rarely got an idea about who is who or what is what. We don't know what's a god, what's a monster, what's a demon, what's a demigod. It's difficult to discern this. Nevertheless, all Sumerian gods are anthropomorphic. They're human-shaped, for the most part, in behavior and in their appearance. They have a society that resembles human society. They've got an assembly of elders, which are presided over by an executive leader, a king, and they're all related to one another in one large family. But how this is broken down is not always clear. So the gods are both devoted and capricious at times, just like humans, and they're susceptible to human passions. I would argue in some regards that they are the human passions, like ambition, and anger, and lust. Very much like the planets would become in a psycho-astrotheological conceptualization of the heavenly bodies. So, the Sumerian gods figure in an important cycle of legends about the hero Gilgamesh, who we've mentioned in passing in previous lectures. Most Sumerian myths are divine myths. They're stories of superhuman beings, not mortals. Their themes range from the creation of the universe and the underworld to the creation of humankind and the universal flood. What's interesting is that all these story patterns traveled from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean where they form a part of our own cultural heritage, but essentially they formed what I like to call a Mediterranean substrate, a kind of ur-culture in a way that transcends linguistic and ethnic boundaries. This was spread through agriculture. Okay, so now that we've discussed Sumerian myth for a bit, let's move on to Semitic myth, because this will be the bridge into talk about Babylonians and Hebrews. So, by about 2000 BC, Sumer had fallen under the control of Semites. The Semites are semi-nomadic people who inhabited the steppe on the fringes of the Arabian desert and basically were in constant conflict with the Mesopotamian river people. The Semites are not a united people or race. The term's a modern one. It's taken from the Bible, Genesis 10:21-31, where Shem, hence Shemite or Semite, the son of Noah, is called the father of Ashur, as in the Assyrians, the Assyrians. These were another Semitic people. Shem was also the father of Aram, the Semitic Arameans who lived in Damascus. And also he would be the father of Eber, where we get the Semitic Hebrews. So Semitic designates both a linguistic group and its associated cultural patterns. Okay, so led by Sargon the Great, who we discussed a while ago, his dates are 2340 BC. The Semitic Akkadians, named after their capital, Akkad, took over the southern Sumerian cities and adopted Sumerian culture. They identified the Sumerian gods with their own deities. Such is the practice in the ancient world. We call this syncretism. And the Akkadians also appropriated Sumerian myth. They refashioned these stories, and they preserved them in cuneiform script on clay tablets. The Sumerian language, as a living language, disappeared, and by 2000 BC, it was like Latin in our day, where Sumerian was only spoken by scholars and priests. Okay, so later there was a reorganization of power, which led to the rise of the Semitic Babylonians, whose capital was the famous city of Babylon. Under their leader, Hammurabi, whose date is around 1750 BC, this is the Hammurabi of the Code of Hammurabi, they fashioned a temporary political unity from the scattered city-states of southern Sumer. After Hammurabi's death, this empire, this Babylonian empire of sorts, essentially one of the first empires, it succumbed to attacks from the nomadic and the semi-nomadic mountain people to the east. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel, which means the gate of God. Ba is gate, Bel, El, Baal. These are all Semitic names for God. These may have been inspired by the great ziggurats built in Babylon by Hammurabi. So from this early manifestation of the Babylonians comes our most important pre-Greek myth, the Enuma Elish, which means when on high. This was a real cult hymn read at an annual New Year's festival, and it recounts the making of the world in its present arrangement. So I'm going to list the syncretism which took place. So the Sumerian An became the Akkadian and the Babylonian Anu, and this is the sky god. An means heaven. Inanna, the goddess of sexual love and war, of attraction and repulsion, became Ishtar in the Akkadian and Babylonian religion. Enlil became Marduk in the Babylonian religion. He was the storm god. He was a local deity that was raised to this status. Enki, the god of sweet water, wisdom, and magic, became Ea. For you black metal fans out there, there's a great song by Burzum called Ea, Lord of the Depths, and this was about this character. Ki, the earth goddess, doesn't have an equivalent in Babylonian, neither does Ereshkigal. And Utu, who was the Sumerian sun god, became Shamash in Babylonian. Okay, so let's fast forward now. So in 586 BC, the Chaldeans, a Babylonian dynasty led by the famous Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadrezzar, those are interchangeable names, captured Jerusalem. So this king destroyed Solomon's temple and deported the Hebrew leaders to Babylon, where they and their descendants would remain for about 50 years under the spell of Mesopotamian culture. So the Babylonian captivity became a time of deep soul searching for the Hebrews. In looking for reasons why Yahweh had abandoned them, the Hebrews looked back on their own ancient traditions. They looked back on their written texts, which dated back to about 800 BC or earlier, and they combined these texts with Babylonian myths that they were saturated in, and they created a coherent, though sometimes legendary, account of a Jewish past. This past extended all the way back to the creation of the universe. To this account, the Hebrew scholars added translations of Egyptian proverbs. This is where a large portion of the Proverbs and Psalms come from. And they also added admonishments by prophets, which had been written down at a different date and had been written in different original languages. All of these together would form the book that much later, around 90 AD, became the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, as Christians call it. Obviously, Jews have no reason to call it an Old Testament. It is the only testament. It is the Torah. So the writing system used by the Hebrews was often called the Phoenician alphabet, but it's really a highly condensed syllabary of 22 signs, each of which stood for a single syllable in which only the consonant was specified. This is the reason why, for example, when we're talking about the Tetragrammaton, the name of God, we, in English, either supply the vowels A and E to make Yahweh, or we pronounce it Jehovah by supplying different vowels. Phoenician writing had been a great advance over the clumsy cuneiform, and it was widely used to record lots of Semitic languages after the year 1000 BC. In the empire of the Assyrians, who ruled from the 9th to the 7th centuries BC, records were kept in duplicates. They had both cuneiform tablets, and they also had Phoenician writing on papyrus. in a Semitic language called Aramaic. This is the language that Jesus would speak. So, because the vowels weren't specified, Phoenician writing was pretty difficult to read, and this is a fact that's given great prestige to rabbis and teachers, men who could read and interpret ancient texts. One required a fair degree of education, as today, to read and write, and it was even more difficult to read and write then than it is now. Our letters transliterate, for the most part, what we say. That is, the phonetic sounds of what we say. This was not so. Modern Arabic script, which is used all over the world today, is a slightly modified form of the Phoenician alphabet, and so is the revolutionary Greek alphabet, which specified two types of signs, one consonantal and the other vocalic. Alright, so, in any case, let's talk about the Babylonian Enuma Elish. I want to dig into this in detail, because this story has huge influence over the book of Genesis, which in its own right would have a huge influence on the history of this entire planet. So, the poem opens with the gods of the primordial waters. There's the male Apsu, he's the fresh water, also known as Ea. And then there's the female Tiamat. This was a dragon goddess who represented salt water, the ocean. So here's a quote from the poem itself. When on high heaven was not yet named, nor was the hard ground below called by name, there was nothing but primordial Apsu, the begetter, and Mother Tiamat, she who gave birth to everything. The waters of Tiamat and Apsu were mingled together as a single body. No one had woven a reed hut. There was no marshland. It was a time before the gods had come into being, before they were called by name, or had their destinies determined. This was when the gods took form within them. Lamu and Lahamu were brought forth, called by their names before they had grown. Anshar and Kishar took form, greater than the others. They made the days long, added on years, and Anu was their heir, rival to his own fathers. So with Lamu and Lahamu, who are mud, the creation began, just like Gaia, or Earth, appeared out of chaos in the Greek account. From Apsu and Tiamat, the two types of water, came 4 generations of gods. Eros, in Hesiod's account, which is erotic love, but kind of more broadly attraction, or the notion of first motion, accompanied Gaia and chaos, and in the Enuma Elish, this role was played by Ishtar or Inanna. So all this noise or activity disturbed the rest of Apsu, the salt water, and with his officer Mumu, Apsu went to Tiamat to complain. He said, "I cannot stand their ways. The day brings no respite, and the night no rest. I will ruin their ways and drive them away. Then may peace come again and sleep." Although the goddess Tiamat vigorously opposed Apsu's wish to destroy their troublesome offspring, Mumu urged them on, and this advice pleased Apsu to the point that his face grew radiant. So when the younger gods heard of the plan to destroy them, they naturally fell into panic. Only Ea, who, quote, knows everything, the skillful, the wise, kept his head. So Ea cast a spell over Apsu and Mumu, sending both of them into a deep sleep. He killed Apsu, strung a rope through Mumu's nose, and imprisoned him. On top of the dead Apsu, Ea built his house, into which he moved with his wife. Apsu's wife soon gave birth to the real hero of the poem, Marduk. This is the god of Babylon. So here's a little spiel about Marduk. He sucked from the teats of goddesses, his nurse filled him with glory. His body was charming, sparkling his eyes. He was born fully developed, mighty from the start. When his father Ea looked upon him, he rejoiced and beamed. His heart was gladdened. He made him perfect, a god twice over. Exalted above all, he was superlative in every way. His limbs were well made, impossible to describe, beyond comprehension, hard to perceive. 4 were his eyes, 4 were his ears. When he opened his mouth, fire shot forth. His 4 ears were huge. His 4 eyes saw all that was. His limbs were immense. He was enormously handsome. So, Marduk's grandfather, Anu, was so proud that he fashioned 4 winds for Marduk's plaything. The winds blew constantly to and fro, and this again stirred the waters of Tiamat, causing the older gods to complain again. Tiamat, who earlier defended the younger gods, was now determined to destroy them. In order to do this, she begets an army of monsters to help her. She set up the snake with horns, the dragon, the Lamu hero, the lion demon, the rabid dog, and the scorpion man, savage Umu devils, fishmen, the bull man. To lead on this horde, she chose a new husband, Kingu, her only lover. She placed him on a throne and armed him with the mysterious Tablet of Destiny, which gave him power over the universe. Now notice this. The tablet, which grants power over the universe. These were written on tablets. The tablet contains writing. The people who put this story together were well aware that writing, that language, was the key to power over the entire universe. So when Ea heard these preparations, he lost his nerve and he ran to the god Anshar. Anshar bit his lip, slapped his thigh, and demanded that Ea go to war against Tiamat. At this point in the story, the tablet is broken. We have a big lacuna. But apparently Ea was unsuccessful. So when the text resumes, it's Anu who attacks Tiamat. She puts her hand against him, and Anu runs away in terror. At the moment of crisis, the gods lose all hope. They sink into despair, as they do in many Mesopotamian myths. Again, gods are not above basic human emotions. So after this, Anshar remembers Marduk, whose moment had now come. He kissed Marduk on the lips and Marduk agrees to fight Tiamat and her army of monsters, but only on the condition that he be given absolute power as a reward. We have the story here of men giving over their freedom for protection. Marduk says, "My word alone shall establish fate, not yours. What I fashion shall last forever. What my lips decree shall never be changed, never altered." Hastily the gods agreed. They gave him a scepter, a throne, a royal robe. They gave him relentless weapons to overwhelm the foe. Go slice the throat of Tiamat. Let the winds bring her blood, tidings of joy. I hope what's going on here is not lost on you in the greater context of what we've been talking about throughout all of our sessions. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't numerous interpretations to this story. Astrological interpretations, natural etiological interpretations. But there is certainly this dimension at work of the story of the gods becoming subject to Babylon, to Marduk. So, taking a bow and arrows, a mace and a net, flashing lightning around him, and 7 winds at his back, Marduk mounts his chariot. This is the image of a thunderstorm rolling in through the sky. Kind of like Santa Claus, the chariot's team were named Killer, Ruthless, Racer, and Flyer, and their teeth drip with poison. So he roars down the road toward Tiamat, this giant dragon goddess who represents the ocean. But when Marduk sees her, he, like Ea and Anu before him, loses his nerve. Over time, he regains his courage, and he rebukes her taunts, and she's seized by an uncontrollable rage. She attacks him. Tiamat and Marduk, the wisest god, locked together. They tangled in the hand-to-hand, clasped in battle. Marduk spread out his net to catch her. The storm that followed behind him he splashed in her face. When Tiamat opened her wide mouth to swallow him, he drove down the storm so she could not close her lips. The savage winds swelled her belly. Her body puffed up and her mouth opened wide. He fired his arrow and it burst her belly, carved through her guts and split her heart, wrecked and extinguished her life. He threw down the corpse, and he trod on it. The army of monsters tries to flee, but Marduk catches them in his net, and he fixes them up with ropes and binds their arms, and he imprisons Kingu and takes control of the Tablet of Destiny. This tablet, this writing that grants him power over the universe. Marduk then trod on Tiamat's legs. With his mighty mace he smashed her skull. When he had sliced open the arteries of her blood, the north wind bore it to places unknown. When the gods saw what happened, they were joyous, radiant. They brought gifts of homage to Marduk. But the Lord paused to look at her corpse, so that he might divide the monster and fashion clever things. He split her like a clamshell in 2 parts. Half he raised up high, calling it the sky. He lowered the bar and set up watchmen. He commanded them never to let her waters escape. On top of the corpse, Marduk built a large temple and cult centers for Anu. He also built centers for Enlil and Ea. He made the constellations. He set up the calendar. He put the North Star in its place, and he brought forth the sun and the moon. From Tiamat's spittle, he made the surging clouds, the wind, and the rain. From her poison, remember she's a dragon, he made the billowing fog. He heaped a mountain over her head and pierced her eyes, from which flow the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. He heaped other mountains over her breasts. He bent her tail into the sky to make the Milky Way, and with her genitals he held up the sky. Marduk returned home in triumph. He delivered the tablet of destiny to Anu, and he presented his captives before the gods. He washed off the gore of battle, dressed in his royal attire, and sat on a high throne to receive homage from the gods. He then proclaimed that he would build a great temple, a luxurious dwelling for himself and for all the gods when they came to visit. He announced another plan. I will mash blood together and bones, and make a primeval human. Human shall be his name. His purpose will be to serve the gods, that they might be at ease. He brought the rebel Kingu before the assembly. They tied him up and dragged him in before Ea. They carried out the execution, severed his arteries. From his blood they made man. Ea made labor to be a human's lot, but the gods he set free. If you want to hear the story of our enslavement, it's right here. According to this tale written by priests, mankind was made to serve the gods. Mankind was made to serve those who invented these geniuses or minds. Labor is a human lot. The gods, however, are free. After this, Marduk divides the gods between those who live in the sky and those who live beneath the earth. The grateful gods begin to build a palace for Marduk, and after 2 years they create a great ziggurat. This is the great ziggurat of Babylon. They hold a banquet, they proclaim Marduk Lord of the universe, and the story ends with a list of 50 names for Marduk. This makes up more than 1/4 of the total poem. There are detailed explanations for each of these names. So, in this way, the world was made from the body of Tiamat. And the same order of kingship was established among the gods as in Babylon itself. In the Enuma Elish and in other Mesopotamian myths, the original creative element is watery, feminine, ambivalent. It's both life-giving and life-destroying. Remember, we were discussing the debate in the Greek world as to what the primal substance was. Well, water was one of these, and this is the prime substance of choice from the Mesopotamian side of mythology. These elements are treated very ambivalently. They are sources of creation in as much as they are sources of destruction. The dangerous, chaotic waters are represented by a monster or a dragon, Tiamat, which a hero has to overcome in order to fashion the cosmos. There is a complex association between water, chaos, formless shifting monsters, and death, dissolution, liberation, freedom. In myth, dragon combat and cosmogony can often be one and the same. A hero, a warlike, patriarchal, male god figure, usually establishes world order and his own permanent reign over the corpse of a female monster, over the corpse of matter itself. Mesopotamian divine myths, like Hesiod's story in Greece, envision the formation and organization of the world and of human society as process and change. The world has not always been as it is now. Its initial chaotic state as primeval waters has moved to the orderly state which we've created for you. A younger generation opposes, overcomes, and controls an older generation, and the present world order comes into being. So we have Apsu and Tiamat first, and then we get their descendants. These gods bring a principle of movement into the world. This is represented by their activity or their clamor, which wakes up the sleeping gods. And this contrasts sharply with the older forces of chaos, which stand for inactivity and inertia. This is symbolized by their desire to sleep. This is a primordial oneness in which there is no action. The primordial god's resistance to change leads to a battle in which newer gods overthrow the older, and this succession motif, as we've seen, is central to Greek myth as well. So in the first round of battle, the wise and clever Ea, the soft water, overcomes Apsu, the salt water, by a spell. His magical power resides in the spoken word, in language. Ea's wisdom and cleverness are contrasted with Apsu's brutish lust to destroy. The dragon slayer is clever and tricky, and his opponent is dull and stupid. It's a common folktale motif. So Tiamat, like Gaia, manages to be both beneficent and malevolent. She opposes her husband's destructive designs, but when Apsu is killed, she becomes the destructive monster herself. Later, in a sort of fractal repetition of the succession motif, Tiamat is destroyed by her own grandson Marduk, who becomes ruler of the world. Marduk is a local Babylonian city god, but in the myth, he's simply a substitution for Enlil, who is the ancient Mesopotamian storm god from Sumer. The Babylonian city god replaces the storm god of the Sumerians. So in both the Enuma Elish and Hesiod's theogony, the first generation of gods is made up of primal pairs. We've got Apsu and Tiamat, or Uranus and Gaia. The fathers Apsu and Uranus hate their first children, who are begotten within the mother, within matter, and in an initial round of conflict, the clever sons Ea and Cronus overthrow their fathers. In the second round of conflict, the gods of the third generation, Marduk, or Zeus in the Greek tradition, revolt against an earlier divine generation. We've got terrible monsters being overcome, Tiamat and her army in the Enuma Elish, or the Titans and Typhon in the Greek story. The storm god is then made king, and Mesopotamian and Greek myths alike report this sort of cosmic history that begins with mighty powers of nature and then ends in the organization of the universe as a monarchic, patriarchal state. If we were to look also at Hittite mythology, which is Indo-European in its language, but Semitic in its form, we would see that this same pattern is reflected. You can look this up yourself. It's called the Song of Ulikumi. It's about the Hittite storm god Teshub and his fight against the dragon of chaos, Ulikumi. So there are differences in detail and in tone between the Eastern and Greek stories. The writing systems of Mesopotamia are as rich as Greek in terms of giving color to the stories. But in any case, there are striking similarities that prove that these myths are of Eastern origin. Either that, or they come from one substrate. They have some sort of participation in a primordial unity of older myths. But either way, those would have come from the Near East and not from Europe. So in closing, I just want to talk about the biblical creation story, which was written down sometime during the Babylonian exile and contains many facets of Babylonian mythology. For lots of Westerners, the most commonly known story of creation is the one reported in the biblical narrative of Genesis, Genesis 1:1-2. There are actually two creation stories in Genesis, but we're going to discuss the first one. So I'm going to read from the Old Testament. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless and unbounded mass, with darkness covering its fluid chaos, and with a wind, ruach. This is like the Greek pneuma or the Latin spiritus. It may mean air in motion, but it also means psychological power, psyche. There was a wind from God sweeping over it. In the Hebrew, we have the plural Elohim floating over the deep. This is not polytheism, this is just a plural of respect. English people don't have this, but most other Indo-European languages at least have this concept. It's in Hebrew as well. If you want to refer to someone respectfully, you do it in the plural. Okay, so God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This is what made it possible for one to distinguish things, to discriminate, to draw up dividing lines between objects. This is also the light that illuminates the intellect. So God saw the goodness of the light and separated it from the darkness. The light he called, or created. The light he called, for to name something is to create it. This is the power of the word at work. The light he called day, and the darkness he called night. Thus evening and morning came into being, a complete day. Then God said, "Let there be a partition." Literally, let there be something solid in the middle of the watery chaos, spreading out to separate the waters. So it came about, and the partition divided the waters below it from those above. God called this partition sky, the atmosphere. The evening came, and the morning, making up the second day. So this Hebrew text of Genesis, which didn't reach its final form until around 400 BC, is an edited account based on several earlier sources. Some of these use different names for God. We have the Elohist, who uses El. We have the Yahwist, who uses Yahweh. These are different sources. From these different sources, Hebrew scholars created a text suitable to the doctrinal needs of a monotheistic religion, a Judah-centric, exclusive monotheistic religion, focused on the temple, focused on the supremacy of Judah among all the tribes of Israel. The Hebrew account differs from the Mesopotamian account in its notion of a single, transcendent God, with no rivals who stand before and beyond the creation. It's similar to the Mesopotamian myth in its picture of a universe beginning in a watery mass that's split into an above and a below, or heaven and earth, An and Ki. In the Mesopotamian and Hittite accounts, the great elements of nature are deified, whereas in the Hebrew account, the powers that made the world are simply stripped of personal names and attributes. So An or Anu or Anush becomes simply sky, which is really all that An, Anu, and Anush mean. They're just stripped of their divine conception. Enlil, Teshub, Marduk, the god of storm, becomes the wind that moves across the deep, the Ruach. Ki is the dry land, and Enki, or Ea, is the water from which the dry land is separated, the sweet water. The water that stands opposed to the water that existed before creation, the salt water. So for centuries, Christian theologians have debated whether creation took place ex nihilo, out of nothing, or whether it was out of something formless. The Hebrew text, however, like its Mesopotamian forebears, envisions creation as a process of separation, of division within an internal oneness. This will become increasingly important when we get on the topic of Gnosticism. That won't be for some time. In the Enuma Elish, the primordial waters are personified as the great dragon Tiamat, whom the creator of the cosmos has to overcome. Although not a part of the biblical creation story, this myth is dimly reflected in other biblical passages. In Isaiah 27:1, we've got this verse, "In that day Yahweh with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan," which means twister or coiler, "the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea." Ulikumi, the Hittite dragon, also stands in the sea, whom Teshub attacks with a special cutting tool, the very one by which heaven was first separated from earth, in the same way that Saturn uses a sickle to castrate Uranus, who is locked in sexual union with Gaia, and this causes him to float up away from the earth and become the sky. Okay, so we've gone over our time for today. I'm going to come back to this next session and talk about the creation of mortals and the flood. You've been listening to the Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, and I'm Dan Attrell, signing off. Thanks for listening.